This video today is from the Personal Development School Board, and it's for the preparation of accreditation, and it's training for our submissions. The Personal Development School offers an umbrella organisation home and recognition of independent workshops, courses, programs from several hours duration to full diploma programs. So firstly, I'm going to speak to you a little about the pre-submission preparation, and then Wayne will go further and also use the PowerPoint, so that will be available for everyone who needs it in the future. So the pre-submission preparation is what I've been doing with people just recently, the last few submissions that we've had. So the author advises the board of their proposed submission and assists the board in planning their schedule, particularly in terms of their mentor. The author will be assigned a mentor to guide the pre-submission process and follow through to ensure 3 fundamental steps. The proposed submission is written within the self-responsibility and education model. It's the authentic work of the author, and it does not contravene copyright law. The mentor will advise the author to proceed to registration or review their proposed submission. To proceed from pre-submission to the accreditation process, the mentor advises the IKC register of the name of the author, the email, the title of the course, and the number of hours or days that's proposed, and requests an invoice be sent to the author. And once the application form and submission fee is paid, an assigned team will go through the work, word for word, chapter by chapter, and bring a report to the board. The mentor is the PDS board go-to person from pre-submission till the accreditation process is complete. And the mentor, or in our case at the moment, the dean, will phone, call, or email the author with congratulations and explain the next step. The next step after the accreditation process is that the registrar will send a congratulatory letter and contract to be signed and include the name of the future guardian or benefactor. However, after submission, there are still specific steps in the accreditation process, and Wayne will go through those now.
Thank you, Sylvia. As we go through, I've summarized the material I'm discussing on slides, but to make it easier, I'm using certain abbreviations. Whenever you see IKC, that stands for the International Kinesiology College. PDS stands for the Personal Development School, which is one of the 3 schools along with the professional school that makes up the International Kinesiology College. And I'm using the word course, and that could be for workshop, class, course, etc. So that just makes it easier as we go through. Now, the course submissions, as Sylvia explained, the submission fee is sent to the IKC head office, which happens to be in Australia, and then the submission goes to the dean of the Personal Development School, and one of them goes to the IKC headquarters. So there are 2 submissions. The submission involves the manual, all the documentation that's required so that the head office has it, and then the dean has it, and she distributes it to the people on the Personal Development School Board that will be going through the documentation, making sure it ticks all the boxes. Now, the course submission fees are on the website, but any course up to 2 days in length, it's going to cost €135. Courses of more than 2 days, up to as much as 8 days, €180 for the submission. Any days beyond that, days 9 through 16, an additional €15 per day. And if the course happens to be more than 17 days and above, an additional €7.5. That gives you the costs at the present time. Now, we're going to be dividing this into 2 parts. First one, application for the course endorsement. You'll be asked to put in the name of the applicant and the name of the author. Now, in some cases, that may be different. For example, we've just had a course that we've gone through thoroughly and approved, and that was from Sandy Gannon. In her case, it was submitted after her death by one of her students, Helena Arguelles. So that's a particular case where the course author was not available, but Helena put the application in on her behalf. Then we have contact information, so we know how to contact you if we have any questions that arise. The name of the course, number of hours for which you're seeking for the course, and in some cases there may be just some distant hours required in that total course hour submission. Now, the manual should be of good quality. Now, what does that mean? We'd expect all manuals to have a table of contents because that's going to be the fastest, most effective way for the student to be able to find the information that they know is in the manual. We need to have numbered pages, obviously for easy access. There needs to be a bibliography or references within the manual as well, and adequate referencing of source material. Now that needs to be referenced within the manual, so then people can then go to the index, and we'll explain that in more detail a little bit later on, because it's important that a student is able to track down original source material, because in some cases they will want to dig more deeply into some of that material and maybe check up on it in some cases. The manual also needs to be aesthetically pleasing, because if we have a manual that has lots of mistakes, materials duplicated, it's all over the place, it's not clear, it's very difficult to learn effectively when you have poor material to work with. So we expect it to be visually pleasing, free of obvious errors. It needs to be clear, understandable, accurate, unambiguous, because this is what the students are going to be using once they go home and start working with the material. Now, you can't expect the student to be able to write down clear line-by-line instructions of kinesiological procedures as you're teaching a class. So in this case, we expect all kinesiological procedures to be written down line by line, very clear, so it's easy for the student outside of class to go through and duplicate what they saw in class, what they demonstrated, and that's how the learning process occurs. Most of it's outside of the classroom. And these need to all be in the manual. Now, if the procedures are unclear or if they're insufficient, then that's going to encourage your student to be sloppy, inaccurate, and you wouldn't want that. You want to have students out there that are faithfully duplicating what they saw demonstrated in class, what they learned in class. We're also looking for, are there clearing tests given within the class, any class involving kinesiological material? Some people don't use clearing tests, but if you don't use clearing tests, there's too much room for inaccuracy. So we do expect clearing tests to be documented, demonstrated very clearly, written clearly in the manual. And very importantly, as Sylvia mentioned, does the manual follow the self-responsibility and the educational models? Those are very important. In fact, so important that when the Personal Development School Board was set up in 2009, we came up with used definitions for both of those. And the self-responsibility model can be defined as a non-medical approach to health and well-being that does not diagnose, treat, or prescribe. We're not medical doctors. We're not pretending to be medical doctors. We're not within the medical model. We're safely outside of that. It's an approach that facilitates and empowers the client to take responsibility for their health and well-being. And so we have to ask, as we go through the documentation, are these procedures that we're reading about, are they ones that the student can use for themselves at home? Now, the educational model aims to provide the participant with tools and methods for self-help, stress management, and ongoing personal development. So is the student being educated during the private session or balanced as the procedures are being followed? That's really important, because educate means to draw out. So are we drawing out information from the student? Are they able to see the connection between what the muscle testing is showing and and their own experience, because if they're just part of something, it's been done to them, that's the medical model. We're not interested in that. And do the procedures that are being used, do they actually facilitate change within the individual? So courses and workshops should provide participants with tools to handle stress. That's really important, particularly in this day and age. Do they give tools for personal development? That's important. And they need to be clear and written in understandable language. And they need to be non-discriminatory in terms of ethnicity, gender, personalities, belief systems, background, and personal circumstances. We also need to see a copyright statement by the author or the owner of the course. So if the applicant is not the author of the course or the workshop, we need to see a letter from the author or copyright owner, which is giving permission for the application, and that must be included with the submission. And we need to also see what are the reasons why the author did not make the application. Now, in terms of hours, you'll be asked to indicate how many hours are going to be used for theoretical material, demonstrations, and most importantly, for practice in the workshop. We don't want to see just lectures with no practice, because it's the practice of the material that allows the student to get the learning that you want. We're also going to be asking for aims and objectives, because it's your aims and your objectives that help define what it is that you intend your students to learn. They allow you to be more focused. When you're more focused in your teaching is going to come across as being more effective. So that's why the aims and objectives are real important. And without them, your teaching is going to suffer. And if your teaching is poor, the students are not going to learn as much. They'll be disgruntled. It's not going to be a happy experience for them or for you. So stating your aims and objectives at the beginning of a manual or at the beginning of the course, or both, make it easier for your students to see the overview. They know where they're headed. They can be happier students. And there's less chance that they're going to be complaining that they didn't get what they expected out of the course when they initially signed up and paid for it. Now, we also ask if you have available advertising and promotional material, we ask to see that. Why? Because on your advertising material, generally you're going to be highlighting your teaching objectives and aims, so we can see what it is that the student can expect to get out of the course. But that should be clearly spelled out. We need to see that if it's available, because that makes it easier for us to see what the course is about and what it is that the student can expect to get out of it. We also expect a lesson plan. If you're in a regular school system, you would be operating with lesson plans, because the lesson plan gives you the roadmap of the territory. It gives you the quantity and the material that's going to be covered. It allows you to stay on track in terms of time. It allows you to increase your focus. And as importantly, from our perspective on the Personal Development School Board, it gives us a better idea of your course content. It also shows us how much time you're allotting to delivering the material by way of lecture, by how much time you're giving to demonstrations, and more importantly, how much time you're giving to the student to actually workshop the material in the class. Because if you do lots of demonstrations, lots of lecturing, but there's no workshopping material, the students are not going to be able to faithfully learn the material, go out and reproduce it as you would like. And is it time for questions and answers? That's real important, because lots of times students will have questions. If they don't get the opportunity to get those answered, then they're going to be more confused, and we don't want that, would we? Now, why are the learning outcomes important? Well, if you know what it is you want your students to achieve by the end of the course, it makes it a lot easier for you to focus on delivering those results. So it may sound as though we're asking for a lot of material, but when you think about it, it's actually for your good and the good of your students. We also ask for a class evaluation or feedback form. Now, this is important. It's a very effective way to see that you're meeting your students' needs. Now, we've seen lots of evaluation forms, lots of feedback forms, and some of them are substandard because they just check on the box, and we don't see on some forms that there's any place for people to give written feedback of a more critical nature. And that's important because if you don't allow the student to give you that sort of feedback, you could have major teaching errors and not recognize it. So we'd expect to see some questions such as, how do you think the course could have been improved? Please comment on the course content. Please comment on the teaching environment. Please comment on teaching style. And you might not feel brave enough to ask those questions, but if you don't ask those questions, the students don't give you an opportunity to point out some obvious things that once you become aware of, you're in a position to change. So we want to see, is there an opportunity for students to give you critical feedback? Getting honest feedback like that might be a little bit scary. Some of it might even hurt a little bit, but it's important that you recognize what your weaknesses are, because if you don't see what the weaknesses are, or the students don't get an opportunity to tell you what they are, then how are you going to make the change? Because a lot of times we're blind to obvious deficits in teaching style, content, or classroom management, and maybe facilities within the class. Now, it's on the Personal Development School Board. When we look at applications, this is where we often pick up the fact that the kinesiology being taught in the classes is not up to scratch. A lot of times I shouldn't say a lot of times, but sometimes we see no evidence of clearing tests being used. And if there's no basic clearing tests being used, there's too much room for error and people not getting accurate information from the student that they're working with. And we will also find out that sometimes the students indicate there's just not enough time to practice the techniques, so they go out confused. If they go out confused, it's very unlikely they're going to do some of that material and then they won't use it, which would be such a pity. Now, details of knowledge assessment. How is it that you intend to measure whether your students are actually understanding what you're teaching them? Do they grasp the theoretical aspects you're talking about? Can they do the balances easily? How are you going to measure that? We need to see some evidence that you've thought about it and you've got a plan in place to determine that information. We also ask for prerequisites. Sometimes we see advanced kinesiological procedures being taught within a class, and yet we know that some of these people don't even have basic touch for health classes. So we're wondering, how's this going to work? Here, they're expected to learn really advanced material, which is really a push for people that are touch for health instructors, yet they don't even have basic material. That's not going to work. And if it doesn't work, they're not going to use it. It's not going to be a good reflection on you as a teacher. And you're not going to do your students a good turn if they're totally overwhelmed. So we need to look at that, make sure there are adequate prerequisites in place so you get students that have the background, the foundation to be able to handle the material that you're proposing that they learn. We also ask for a list of current instructors. Now, having a number of instructors out there is a good sign to us, because it means that the course has been taught in the real world. There have been people that have taken those courses, like the material sufficiently that they've decided, wow, we'd like to go out there and teach that material. And so they've taken the training from you and they're out there teaching us. That's a good measure for us to see, because there's evidence that what you're teaching is great. And even if you have instructors in a number of different countries, that's even better, because it means it's been tested in the marketplace and is obviously standing its ground. We ask for copies of certificates also. Do you issue certificates of attendance only? And do you actually issue certificates of competency? Because those are two different things. Competency means you have in place a way in which you can determine that the person is actually competent with the material that they learned. Now, what if you're the joint author of a course? As Sylvia mentioned, we need to see a written statement from the joint author giving you permission to submit the course to the Personal Development School. Now, it may be that they're not teaching the course at the present time. However, problems could arise if they decide to teach the course in the future. So what happens then? Who owns the course in the event of your death? These are questions. Most of us don't like to look about the fact that we are going to die sometime, but we have to be realistic, because we know from practical experience that in the past, course authors have died, and then there's been a fight over control of that material, and sometimes even going to law courts. So we want to do our part to make sure that does not happen with your material. So the way to handle that is to ask these difficult questions ahead of time and make sure there's a plan in place. What's going to happen once you die? Who owns the course? Is it going to be taken care of? What happens if there's joint authors? One person's not teaching. What happens if they decide that later on they want to teach? How are we going to take care of that? Now, this is the biggest part of it, and I've left it to the end. We're asking with all submissions that we have a list of references and acknowledgements. It's important that we see where the material is coming from. We can tell you that on the board, we have people with decades of experience. So collectively between us, we've had access to lots and lots of authors. For example, I've taken classes from over 40 different authors of material. So that gives you a very broad foundation. So we can often recognize where material is coming from if it's not being acknowledged. So it's important that there is a track record. We need to see where people get their knowledge from, because none of us comes up with a course without any foundation. We've read material, we've taken coursework, we've gotten foundational material, and we build on that. So we need to find out what's the foundation, where these different ideas coming from. Are the ideas still up to date, or have they been discredited in the meantime? Now, we're particularly looking for plagiarism. Plagiarism is when someone is passing off as their own information that isn't. I remember I wrote a book, this is back in 1985, and I had this person from London congratulate me. He said, "Congratulations, I've just read your book, wonderful job." And I was wondering, wow, why is he saying that? And as I continued reading, he said, "Last weekend, I took a class, a kinesiology class taught in London, and it was all John Diamond's material, no acknowledgement to John Diamond. This instructor is passing it off as their own information." That's plagiarism. And that's why he congratulated me, because when I wrote this book, I said, these are the ideas I've gotten from Touch for Health. These are the ideas I've gotten from biokinesiology. And this is my synthesis. And this is my new contribution building on the backs of those two different foundations. Now, when we define things, the terms in a manual, it's good to give a source. So in one of my manuals, I used the word pica. Here it is here. And I've got a definition. Pica, in, means it's a noun. The eating of substances other than normal food, such as earth or stones. And then I give a reference, the Oxford Concise Dictionary, 9th edition, 1995. So that way, when I'm using a term that people are not familiar with, people can see exactly where you can find that particular definition. And that makes it clear on how I'm going to be using that term within the manual. Now, if you're using the educational model, and that's what we need to be doing with all our course submissions, this is going to be encouraging students to do research. And some of them, some won't be interested. They're just interested in what you can teach them. But some will want to delve into the material, take a deep dive, and that's why it's important to have referencing. So, for example, in one of my books, I talk about cribbing. That's when animals chew on the wooden trough or the fence posts, things like that. And then I provide a reference, Wallace, that should be Lan, I missed the end there, 1994, within the body of the text. Then if that's there, then they can go into the reference at the back. That'll give them the full reference where they can track down that particular book that was published in 1994. If I give a quote within the manual, then I could put Wallach and Lan, 1994, page 56. So if someone were to take the time to find that reference, they don't have to piece through the book, read the entire thing to find the quote. They can go straight to page 56 in the edition that came out in 1994 and see where I got that quote, and I'm attributing the quote to those particular authors. Then at the end of the manual, I have the full reference. Joel Wallach, who's a naturopath and a veterinarian by background, and his medical doctor wife. The book is called Rare Earths, Forbidden Cures, and then it was published by Double Happiness Publishing Co. in 1994, and the publishing house at that time was located in Bonita, California, United States. So that gives all the information required for someone to be able to track down that particular book if they so choose to read more about the material because they find it just so fascinating. Now, there are several acceptable methods for referencing books and articles. So we're not saying that you have to do it a specific way because there's a number of choices there, but any choice you use should cover all of these basics. We expect to see the name or the names of the author or authors of the article or book, the title of the book or article, the publisher, the city or town and state or country of the publishing house, and the year of publication. Now, the year of publication is important because sometimes with a later edition of a book, new materials are added. So if they get an earlier publication, they might not be able to find the material that you're talking about because it was only published in a subsequent edition. Now, if you're referencing an article, it's going to be slightly different. So here's an article that I reference in one of my publications. It's by Russell Blaylock. And Russell Blaylock is an author. He happens to be a medical doctor, a very astute neurosurgeon. So he's the writer. The name of the very short article here, Why Low Vitamin D Endangers Your Health. That's just in regular font, and it's in quotes. But then what's in italics is the name of the publication. In this case, it's a newsletter that I subscribe to on a monthly basis. It's called the Blaylock Wellness Report. 17 tells me it's volume 17, in brackets, the 7th publication for that particular year. 7 is also the number of the month July, so it's the July edition, pages 4 and 8, and there it is, July 2020. So the full reference is Blaylock Russell, Why Low Vitamin D Endangers Your Health, and it's from the Blaylock Wellness Report, volume 17, and it's part 7, pages 4 and 8, published in July of 2020. So that gives you all the information required for someone that wants to track down that particular article that they found so interesting. Now, if I'm referring to someone in a manual, there's another way I could do it. So in one of my manuals, I talk about Jim Fixx. I spent 35 years in the United States, and I used to run. So I know that Jim Fixx was the one that popularized the jogging craze in the United States. So when I'm talking about jogging aerobic exercise, then I might be talking about Jim Fixx within my text. And then in the bibliography at the end of the manual, I can provide a reference. For example, I could put Jim Fixx, so that's his name. And if people go to Wikipedia, which is the easy source for a lot of people to access online, it's a free encyclopedia, then all they'd have to do is type this into their search bar or actually click on this in the text and it will take them to that information in Wikipedia about Jim Fixx. And so this gives you a way in which you can put the link within your text. The student reading the text can click on that link and go straight to that reference and get the material that they want to read. That reference can be in the text itself. It can be also at the end of in the references at the end of the manual. Now, there's another way of handling it. Let's say in the past, most of us, when we've written books, and I've written many books and workshop manuals, in the past, what we've had is references and bibliography at the back. That was the standard way things were being done. These days, books that I read lots of books. I read at least 3 books a month, and they sometimes have footnotes. They sometimes have endnotes. They sometimes have notes. So let me just discuss that briefly, because if you don't have a lot of references in your article or in your book, it may be that you might want to use just footnotes. Because a footnote has the advantage that the reference that you want people to be aware of is put at the bottom of the page. So here's an article. If you're writing an article, for example, on the placebo effect, I can put a superscript 5. So here's the quote. The placebo effect makes it difficult to determine just how effective the drug being tested is. And you notice there's a superscript 5. Then at the bottom of the page, you can go down the bottom, it says 5. And you got the author's name, Steve Silberman. The article is called Placebos Are Getting More Effective. Drug Makers Are Desperate to Know Why. In italics, you've got the name of the publication that this article appeared in. It appeared on August 24th, 2009. Then you've got a reference. That's a digital reference, meaning that person can click on that. It will take them on the internet. It will take them to that particular article, and then they can read the article. And the advantage here for a footnote, it's right on the very page that this material is talked about in your publication. So if you don't have very many references in a book, that's one way to do it. Just have them as footnotes at the bottom. However, if you have more than, well, if you have quite a few references, then you can do it as endnotes or notes. And this can be done two ways. One way to do it is at the end of the chapter. So if you had a chapter and it was all about the placebo effect, that's the chapter. At the end of the chapter, you could have notes. And here's reference number 1 that you referred to in the script, number 2, and maybe number 3, for example, is this article by Steve Silberman. So this is given at the end of the chapter that's talking about placebos. Or it could be put at the end of the manual, and we'll talk about that now. So at the end of the manual, they can be called either end notes or notes, it doesn't matter. And they're listed according to chapter. So let's say chapter 5 in your manual discusses the placebo effect. Then at the end of the manual, you look for chapter 5. It says enhancing the placebo effect. Then you've got this particular article by Kevin Spiegel, another one by Sylvia Marino, whoever she is. Then we've got this one here, Steve Silberman, and you've got the reference that you referenced in the text on a certain page. And that's another way, and this is, again, very useful for the student because basically the student wants a way to be able to access interesting information, and it's your job to make it easy for them to be able to do that. Now, general principles in terms of referencing. Any good scholarship requires referencing. Gone are the days where you just wrote anything and just grabbed it from wherever without acknowledging where it comes from. That's plagiarism, that's dishonesty. And I could name top officials in the world that have lost and been discredited because they plagiarized their thesis, for example. So no, you don't want to go there. Now we need to just choose a style you like. Now, how can you determine that? What I'd recommend is get some of the books on your bookshelf, some of your nonfiction books, look at the references, the bibliography at the back, and find a style that you like, and then just copy the way in which they've set it up. Because there are differences, and I'm not going to go into the differences because that's less important to us. On the Personal Development Scoreboard, we just want to know that you've got a system that works, that clearly gives the information that the student needs, author's name, title, publication, date, etc., so they can track it down. Because in the old days, we'd see manuals with really poorly referenced material, and it was just impossible for people to be able to track it down. So find a system that works for you. This allows you to make it easy for the student to track down the information that they're interested in, then just do it. Now, finally, part 2, application with course endorsement. One of the things that we require is that the course being taught to at least 30 people. Now, why is that? Because I've just taught a class on sleep. I taught it in France. And after that class, I thought, well, I can rearrange all this material. So I completely reorganized the way in which I structured the material in the class before I taught in Germany. I'm going to be teaching in New Zealand next month, and I've rearranged it again in a slightly less way. And so when you first start teaching a class, sometimes you find out after teaching it, well, there's a better way of presenting that to make it easier, to make it flow more freely. So we adapt our manuals. So we're not interested in seeing the first edition of your manual. We want to see it after you've taught to at least 30 students, because that way you work through some of this process and it's in a better form. Now, when we read your manual, we're looking for the languaging, and we're asking ourselves, is this written in the self-responsibility model? Is it in the educational model? That's what we want to see. Is it going to enhance the skills of professionals? And another thing you might want to consider, If the AKC faculty are aware of your course, is it likely that they'd recommend it as continuing education for your advanced touch health instructors? Because some of the subject matter would be of interest if the material is sufficient quality. Now, the author also has to agree to accept and abide by the aims and purposes of the AKC, and that you can get from the AKC website, by its bylaws and codes of ethics. And then once accredited, the course author, you, agree to issue AKC endorsed certificates to participants obtaining their course. That means the certificate will have your logo on, it'll have the AKC on the certificate, the Personal Development School, and so that it lends credibility to your course. It says this course has been evaluated by the Personal Development School. We've evaluated, said, yes, it meets our standards of approval, and we're giving our endorsement to this particular course. And then we're going to do everything we can to help you promote it. We're going to allow you to present that material on Meet the Authors, for example, where you get exposure to the international community. And we're allowing you to do that because we approve of the course and we want to support you. Now, the Personal Development School Dean and the board reserve the right to remove an accredited course from the list of PDS endorsed courses if the course author fails to comply with the completions of the endorsement. And this may include non-activity for a period of 6 months or unprofessional behavior, this sort of thing. And then we also expect you to give up-to-date information to the AKC about changes to the workshops or workshop material. Right now, I'm upgrading one of my workshops, and once I've got the manual in new form, then I'll submit that new manual to the AKC headquarters, so the AKC headquarters has my most up-to-date manual for that particular class. And then also asking for permission for details of the successful submission to be published on the AKC website. So I know that was rather a rush, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of background. Are there any things you want to add to that whirlwind, Sylvia?
No, that was really good. That was good. Thank you. And it will be really good, when we're working with the submissions, to just go back and have somewhere to check and just go, yes, I'm on the right track, or I need to send the author back to do some more work and some more research on this.